The girl smiled slyly as she looked into the eyes of Adonis Krondag, the third prince. She called him the former prince. The boys accompanying him were thinking too slowly. The girl knew he would be the next Dragon King. Prince Adonis was under the reliable protection of his battlemate, Grant. The mysterious woman's magical power was surging. She rated Grant as a good subordinate. Although he is a bit rough like that girl, the stranger advised her to keep her subordinates in line. She wanted to just say hello, but they were so on top of her. The girl, who was obliged to protect the prince, became agitated and used a spell that almost destroyed the enemy. They are in the Dead Lands, and if someone were to emerge from the ruins with a huge amount of magical power, obviously anyone would think it was some kind of monster. The stranger doesn't have a scratch on her even though she hit with all her might. The woman in the hat said she wasn't weak, it's just that the man was incapable of more. Grant decided to turn the fire on himself. The prince asked the boys to stop. He wants to hear her out. Adonis apologized for his subordinates. She seemed to know him already, but he still introduced himself, Knight Grant, and the sorceress Scotia to her. The woman introduced herself in return. Her name is Kalissa, but some call her the Dragon Witch Echidna. She was obviously waiting for him. It was her duty after all. Adonis couldn't understand how she knew he was coming. The witch explained it was fate. He had come here for a reason. The prince offered to set aside all these confusing things, and first inquired if she was on their side. Kalissa replied that he was the next Dragon King, but he would be of no use without her. She was going to show him how to use her powers. Indeed, Adonis did not know how to use the Dragon King's skill. The sage was the only one who understood him. He once said that his skill was proof that he was a true lord. When his power is unleashed, the world will change. He had already turned 16 years old, and he still couldn't use his skill. The boy understood perfectly what his father was getting at. He's a member of the royal family who can't use his skill, and this could be a big blow to the royal family's reputation. Adonis realized that he was incompetent, and he really couldn't master the Dragon King's skill yet. But thanks to him, the growth of the monster population around him is suppressed. He mentioned the sage and his mother. The king became agitated at the mention of this woman in front of him. He thought that she had high hopes for her son only because she was too naive. Or does he really believe the words of a dead man and talk about the existence of fairy tale creatures like dragons? And even more so that this skill has the power to banish all monsters and save the world. The king thought he was the only person who could rule the whole world, and it was his duty as a king to banish monsters from this world. His older brother Baran was skillful in his all-elements skill, and in his years, he was worthy of the title of a great magician. His second brother had become the best swordsman on the continent thanks to the skill of the glittering sword. The king made a decision. He ordered Adonis to become a pioneer. Far to the east of their country were uncharted lands. Adonis would explore them and set about expanding their territory. The king would allow him to return only when these lands began to benefit their kingdom. The sage asked the king not to expel Adonis from the kingdom. This skill was proof that he was a true lord, and when his skill is awakened, this world will change. His skill is like a wall that protects their kingdom in turbulent times. Sending him to such distant lands is tantamount to suicide. The king called him a bookworm who can only blow dust off old books. He reminded him who the ruler was. The wise man begged the king to listen. If Adonis died before his powers awakened, this kingdom, even the whole world, would come to an end. For this the king deprived him of his head without regret. As the king put it, it was Adonis' own fault for believing this old man's delusions. He gave him a chance. Now Adonis must go to the uncharted lands of Draglake. It all happened too quickly. If Adonis' skill really had power back then, the sage wouldn't have died. It was his fault that it happened. To learn the power of this skill, Kalissa said to hold out your right hand. She asked what was the most important thing needed for life to spring up in these lands. Adonis thought of water, and that turned out to be correct. Using his skill, he could bring water back to these dried up lands. To do this, all he needs is a name. She said to repeat after her. Adonis knew the words. How could he have forgotten them? He summoned the seventh dragon Tiamat. The appearance of the dragon entailed great magical power. The huge creature blew everything around it. Tiamat clearly needed to be more careful when it appeared. Kalissa informed her that the new king was weak. The dragon himself realized that he had overreached a bit. Tiamat addressed him as a lord. She is a dragon of water. Adonis gave her his name. Grant was a little confused, seeing such a monster for the first time. Scotia tapped him with her staff. It's not a monster, it's a dragon. Kalissa reminded him that the fact that dragons existed had always been undeniable. They had appeared many times in human history and left a mark on it, but it all got lost in the abyss of time. Adonis realized that his new skill allowed him to summon a dragon. Tiamat is the 7th dragon, one of the dragon princesses who are bound to aid whoever has the seal of the Dragon King, all according to the Star Pact. He could use her as he wished. It seemed to her that it would be hard for him to perceive her in this form. Tiamat appeared before him in human form, and proved to be an incredibly attractive girl. Kalesa cited this as one of the reasons why dragons were so easily forgotten. They are always masquerading as humans. Tiamat explained that it's more convenient for them that way, otherwise they would crash everything around them. Human things and buildings are too small for them. Based on Tiamat's words, Adonis assumed that water was her power. The girl noted its usefulness, for she can manipulate water as she wishes. Adonis hoped that with her help they could irrigate this dry land. Tiamat could raise groundwater from beneath the earth. The local groundwater could last for hundreds of years. With water they could revitalize the lands they might be able to. Tiamat asked if the Lord wanted to settle on these lands. The lad replied in agreement. He came here to settle these dead lands. For this purpose, water is just what he needs, and, if it is not too difficult for her, he would like to realize the goal soon. Tiamat positively remarked that the first order should always be the most memorable. Adonis also asked to get them off this islet and remove the excess water. He wanted to use these ruins as a base. Tiamat felt embarrassed for her carelessness. Now they had a base and water. With canals, they would be able to connect this area to the nearest villages. Kalesa reminded her that the Dragon King's power was meant to protect the world and was not meant for such trivial matters. But Adonis, with his innovation, could no longer be thwarted. Stopping at the sage's grave, Adonis informed him that it was time for him to leave for the east and he would never return to this castle again. Yet what he had taught him would stay with him forever. He said goodbye to him. Adonis awoke, trying to recall recent events. He scrutinized the mark on his hand. It was evidence that he had not dreamed it. The skill of the Dragon King is proof that he is a true ruler. A wise man once told him that the power of dragon princesses is truly great, and this power can lead to the destruction of the world if used unskillfully. Going downstairs, he found a worried Scotia. The power of the dragon princesses amazed her when she saw how clean her surroundings had become. After all, she had just rinsed these ruins with water. Fulfilling her lord's requests gave Tiamat pleasure. The prince replied that that was enough for him. Now the boys needed to think about what they would do next. Adonis would like to connect their base to the village of Milma's on the way here. Scotia grudgingly remarked. It seems that the headman of that village frankly hated them. She would say that they had no use for them at all. But Adonis noticed that they had no proper water source in their village, and the village itself seemed very poor to him. If they could solve their water problem, the villagers could help them with further development. The girl would like to believe that. Tiamat gladly agreed to run water to that village. They traveled to the village of Milma's. Adonis made his intentions known to Headman Bellwood and received a grudging response. He declared himself to be serious. As he had heard, there was no proper water source in their village. The headman recognized that since there were few water sources in the area, they had been suffering from water shortage for a long time. But the idea of running a canal here seemed crazy to him. Where would he get the water from? Even if the prince created water with magic, without constant support, it would simply disappear. Adonis assumed he would say that, so it would be better to see for himself. The exclamations of people were heard from the street. Looking outside, Bellwood could not believe his eyes. Adonis, without any approval from the headman, had already wired the canal. The old man still didn't believe that such a thing was possible. As Adonis thought, what was more important was the reaction of the villagers. Left to his own devices, Bellwood slammed the door in front of him. Grant gritted his teeth, displeased at how disrespectful this headman was being to the prince. Adonis tried to be sympathetic, for he too needed time to gather his thoughts in such a situation. A woman named Tarot addressed the villagers. She said that this water had been brought to them by Prince Adonis when he learned that they had a shortage of it, and they should be grateful to him. The people expressed their gratitude to their savior. Having earned the prince's support in this village, the maid left the rest to him. Scotia remarked that she had told them beforehand that the prince had come here not out of banishment but to save these lands. She is much more cunning than she appears. With that, Tarot withdrew. Adonis felt awkward surrounded by the locals. That night, there were angry shouts coming from the headman's house. He was going to contact His Highness Baran immediately. These lands were originally a colony of those the royal family wanted to get rid of. His mission to oversee this territory was about to end soon, and he would be able to return back to the kingdom of Krondeg. If they seriously beautify this land, all his hard work would go to waste. He was also frightened by this strange power that had created the canal in an instant, and he wanted to inform His Highness as soon as possible. Tarot overheard his monologue. Krondake Castle was concerned about the situation in the Deller region. The knights, having reported only the villagers' testimony, did not consider the possibility that they might have been misinformed. Baran expected a more detailed and thorough report. He refused to believe in the existence of monsters within the kingdom, fabulous creatures feared by both humans and beasts. Monsters simply cannot exist. But it intrigued him nonetheless. The appearance of the monsters coincided so aptly with the banishment of Adonis. He thought his father's act too cruel, as if he were afraid of something. It was hard to believe, but what if it was really true? What if his skill really was proof of a true lord? He was contacted by Belwood of Milmuse about Prince Adonis. Baran believed he was desperate when he saw these blighted lands. According to Belwood, he suggested that he stay in Milmuse. As planned, offered him a house. Baran expected to hear something else. Lastly, the headman added that the prince had returned from Draglake in an abyss of despair. Baran liked Adonis's current situation, now that he was just another royal shadow. He thanked him for his excellent work. Baran was tired of the incompetence of his entourage. Tarot monitored the headman's conversation with Baran. The old man could be revealed by his trembling voice, but it was barely noticeable through the magical connection. Belwood knelt before her and formally declared that he had betrayed His Highness Baran and now served Prince Adonis. Tarot agreed to spare him, but she let it be known what would happen to him if she suspected anything. Left to himself, the old man panicked. Trying to pull himself together, he remembered another call the prince had given him for emergencies. It was his last hope. It seemed to Belwood as if a downpour had fallen outside. A drop fell directly on his bald head, but the old man was focused on his thoughts. He was numb with fear when he saw Tiamat herself in front of him. The princess concluded that people never change. In the morning, Adonis was awakened by a worried Grant. He realized that the prince had celebrated late last night and must be very tired, but he thought he should let him know immediately. The villagers discovered the body of the drowned man early in the morning. It was the village headman. Tarot reported that the village headman worked for Prince Baran. No wonder he was acting this way. Adonis guessed that she had made a thorough investigation about him. She had given him a warning yesterday. Tarot did not think it would lead to this. The prince understood that she was doing everything to protect him, but next time he asked her to consult with him first. Tiamat let everyone know it was her doing. Using water, she overheard his conversation with the maid. After the maid left, he tried to contact someone again, so she killed him. But he probably didn't have time to do that. No doubt Prince Baran would have sent soldiers or a scouting party. Adonis hated to admit it, but Tiamat had done the right thing. He realizes that he did not have the time now, but in the future, making such decisions will be on him. He hates it when someone dies because of him, so she should at least consult with him next time. Tiamat admitted that she had been hasty. She doesn't understand humans, but she will do her best. But it is not the custom of dragons to show pity for their lord's enemies. Adonis promised to remember that. Now that they were done, she offered to create a transportation that would travel through the canals. Tiamat used her powers to summon several dragons. These little guys are strong. They can easily transport heavy weights. In addition, they are able to defend themselves, so they can also be used to guard the canal. Adonis reflects on the fact that he doesn't know how to build ships. Tiamat thinks Iggy would be able to do it without a problem. She's the Dragon Princess Yggdrasil, who controls the plants. The boys have managed to set up a base and also run the water they need to keep going. Their next goal is to secure food. They will engage in cultivating the soil. To do this, they will need tools, seedlings, and seeds, and a person who is good at all of this. Dragon Princess Yggdrasil would be perfect. This time, it's better to prepare in advance for the summoning, which could be spectacular again. Therefore, Adonis and Tiamat will return to the base. He instructed Grant and Scotia to take care of things here while he was gone. Tiamat promised to protect him. At Adonis' behest, they are to appoint a new headman for this village. He would like to cooperate with him when they begin to develop. Kalissa rejoiced at the return of the Dragon King. Not finding his constant protection with him, she asked where they were. The lad replied that the boys had stayed in the village. Something had happened there. The witch suggested that it had to do with the possible arrival of the crown's thugs. Adonis added regretfully that apparently just banishing him was not enough for them. Tiamat thought she was capable of flooding the entire capital at once. The boy reminded of the innocent people who should not be harmed. Tarot said that if anything happens, they will arrive today. He has a plan. Kalissa appreciated the idea of using water dragons as transportation. She was suggested by Tiamat. The princess replied that she had simply made the suggestion because the lord needed it. After all, her power belonged to him. Since he had found a use for Tiamat, Kalissa decided to lift the ban on summoning the 7 dragons. Now he could summon all the dragon princesses. However, if he used the 7 dragons incorrectly, he would ruin himself. The witch advised him to summon one at a time to get a feel for their abilities, capabilities, and character, and to decide if he could handle them before summoning a new one. A long time ago, there had been a case where all of them had been summoned at once. At that time, 3 kingdoms were wiped off the face of the earth and 4 new islands were formed. The history he was studying was only the tip of the iceberg. Kalissa was about to leave. She had done her job, now he could use his powers. She had fulfilled her role, which means the enemy is ready as well. To assess the situation, she must head west. Adonis was wary, for is there anything to the west? The witch answered bluntly that it was a threat in his race and Detra. She gave him one piece of advice. If Adonis wants to use the power of the Dragon King to ennoble these lands, that's fine. He should develop, build his country, and remember to build up his military might. The prince is fixated on the latter. That's what the power of Dragon Princesses and the power of the Dragon King are for. That's all she can tell him now. Seeing her leave, Adonis shouted words of thanks to her. The next time they meet, he will be a great Dragon King. Without answering anything, she disappeared. Before summoning Yggdrasil, Adonis asked if she would appear as spectacularly. Tiamat assured him that all would be well. Probably, the boy realized that he was the only one who would suffer here. He began to cast the summoning spell. As soon as he uttered the last word, sprouts arose from beneath the ground. They intertwined into one mighty tree. Adonis knew that something big was coming again. The dragon that was part of this tree had not been summoned in a long time. At the moment of introduction, Adonis immediately introduced himself as her king. She called him brother. Her full name is the tree dragon Yggdrasil, but it's too long, so he can just call her Iggy. Adonis pointed out that this tree was her body. She triumphantly declared that now all the plants of this world are her. The lad inquired if with this body she could take on human form. The dragon performed the transformation. He became a pretty little girl with hopes of a good relationship with him. She immediately noticed that this time her brother was kind and calm, and was glad to meet Tiamat. She apologized for killing Iggy last time. Iggy did not hold a grudge against her. Guy felt awkward at such a sudden request, but he wants her to build a ship that can tow a water dragon. 2 kinds of ships are needed, one to carry cargo and one to carry people. Iggy willingly agreed. The prince also wanted her to grow plants on this land, especially needing vegetables and grains. Seeing the desert they were in, Iggy doubted that it would work out to grow any. Now that they had secured water for their base, their goal should be to develop agriculture. Mrs. Kalissa tells Adonis to build a country and get ready. He doesn't yet know what she warned him about, but the provision of food is necessary. First, they need to survey the soil, and they also need labor. Iggy had erected a ship ready to sail in just a few minutes. She could make a lot of things out of wood. Marveling at the marvel, he thought about sending it to the village. Tiamat noticed something. Grant and Scotia were worried about the prince. The knight saw that he was thinking about something, also sitting in the dark. Scotia noticed that unlike Grant, he had something to think about. The prince apologized for taking on a lot of things. The boys were sympathetic and said that it was not a burden for them. He could rely not only on the Dragon Princesses, but also on them. Adonis confessed that he was afraid of his power. The girl noticed his mark of Dragon King. It was when they were returning from the base. Tiamat told him to look at the back of his palm. He noticed that his emblem had begun to grow. Iggy realized that it was related to the summoning of the second Dragon Princess, so one of his awakened skills was unleashed. Adonis was surprised to learn that this was not the full power of the Dragon King. The princesses told him that if he uses the Dragon King, he gains an awakened skill. For example, if he uses a jet of flame, it awakens into a flame blade. The Dragon King has several awakened skills that appear as he uses it. How many princesses he summons, that many skills will awaken. This time, the Dragon Blessing was awakened. Their power was contained in this emblem. Iggy's power was with him now. He will be able to use it as his own. Returning to his dark past, the boy remembered that he was damn bad at both magic and fencing. Iggy's explanation was that human magic and swordsmanship were no match for a Dragon King. It's the same when humans imitate the movement of monkeys. The Dragon King can only use the power of dragons. He will quickly get used to it and figure it out, and they will help him with it. Thus, Adonis summarized that he has a power that does not even compare to that of humans. He was afraid of himself, afraid that he would become a monster. To cheer him up, Grant put the alcohol found in the dead headman's house on the table. It was quite strong, but it tasted good. The knight offered to drink it with him. Scotia decided to keep them company. At the table, Grant said that in the short time he had spent in this village, he had already made friends with many of the villagers. He asked if the prince realized that he and his power had given them hope here in this god-forsaken place, as Grant once did. When he was still a common soldier, Prince Keel, the head of the Royal Order of Knights, disliked him, and he found himself in dire straits. He did not consider him competent. Instead of sending him into battle like the others, Grant protected the cattle. When he was ready to retire from soldiering, he was asked to accompany the very young Prince Adnis. He knew that the prince, like him, was disliked. Of course, Grant agreed, thinking it was far better than guarding cattle. The words he said to him then made a real knight out of him. That was when Grant decided that he would be a knight who served only Prince Adnis and no one else. He realized that he was unlikely to be relieved by his words, but great power always requires great responsibility. Adnis agreed with him. Grant told him to be proud that he was using his power properly. If the prince strayed from the right path, he would give him a good kicking. Grant may not be as strong as those dragon princesses, he doesn't have supernatural powers, but as an ordinary man, he can keep him from straying from the right path. The knight advised him to confidently do what he thinks is right and suggested that Scotia join him in his words. Scotia remarked that if Grant wanted to hit Prince Adnis, he would just wipe him into powder with his power. But he is right. She is with him of her own free will. Scotia used to be a librarian in the Royal Magical Library. She got into an argument about magic with Prince Baran, the head of the Royal Academy of Magicians. After that, Prince Baran used his connections and she became an outcast. Only the sage continued to teach and support her. The sage was also Adnis' teacher and they both looked at him with eyes full of admiration. Adnis was quite unlike his older brother. That was because he had been taught by the sage from a young age. Perhaps Prince Adnis can change this lost country to finish the work started by their murdered teacher. She said Grant was quite right. They would be able to support him where the Dragon Princesses could not. He could rely on them for everything. And if he needed their moral support, they could handle that too. After all, it's their duty as his subordinates. Grant notices that she is not being completely honest with herself. Adnis was genuinely grateful to the boys. They drank to the future the prince would build. Moonlight illuminated the quiet village. The assassins had figured out the prince by his magic waves. Pulling down the blanket, the assassins discovered the doll. It was unexpected, because the detection magic definitely showed that there were his magic waves here. Adnis, who entered the room, said that attacking him while he was sleeping was mean. He used Iggy's powers, under the effect of which strong plants sprouted across the floor. The prince advised them not to resist, and then perhaps they would not die. The assassin was impressed by such a statement and said that only he would die here. But he acted too slowly, so Adnis had time to imprison him in water chains. Having received the proof, one of them went to the capital to report its power. This is now their main task. The other will kill the prince. To stop the resistance, Adnis had to use force once again. The assassin took the form of a shadow and thrust his blade into him. But it turned out to be a copy of his. As far as they remembered, the prince's skill should have been useless. This power should be reported to Baran as soon as possible. Believing that the hapless Prince Adnis has such a power is hard to believe. Baran must be warned about it. While trying to do something about it, the assassin loses his head. The fugitive saw the silhouette of the Dragon Princess and realized that she was the one to avoid. Tiamat and Iggy acted in concert. Iggy witnessed him being transported within his line of sight, which meant that if his visibility was impaired, the hunter would be victimized. I wonder if he could escape from her forests. The killer could not resist the tree roots that wrapped around his body. From the tower, the boys had a view of the canal waters running alongside the village. Adnis still had no idea how to use these powers. Scotia thought it came out pretty well. He used the roots of the tree, the water chains, also created a copy of himself using water. That's advanced magic, which is difficult even for a great magician. Grant didn't expect anything less from their prince. Oh, and this doll looked a lot like him. The knight asked if he had made it himself. Adnis replied that Tarot had the idea and Yggdrasil had made it. Either way, their plan had worked, and Adnis was grateful to them. He hoped that they would continue to protect him in the future, and the boys hoped that they were really useful to him. But the other princes surprised Grant. They sent assassins to their younger brother. The knight didn't understand why he was bothering them so much. He was no longer the heir to the throne. Why couldn't they just leave him alone? Are they really that thoughtful and cautious? Scotia expressed her dissatisfaction. Even though they had handled the assassins this time, there would surely be others coming. The captive they captured is dead. It seems that he had poison in his mouth. This was to be expected of the king's shadow. When they became assassins, they were ready to die, wanting to keep him alive, of course, but it was to be expected that it wouldn't work. One just had to accept it. But whatever they had planned, they still had time. Adnis thought it would be worthwhile to farm hard now. With the strength of the Dragon Princesses, they can handle this dead land. They should start providing food. The prince was going to utilize the power of the people who live in this village. Grant would be their middleman and Scotia would help him choose what they should grow. This is something only they are capable of. The boys were honored by the prince's trust, and they were ready to give their best. Looking up at the sky, he remembered the sage and was afraid of making a mistake. Grant brought the man the prince had been waiting for. His name was Luke, and he had been chosen as the new village chief. Adonis had something to show him. This was their experimental farm. Luke couldn't imagine how they had managed to make it in such a short period of time, and on dead land. Adonis said that his men were now doing research on what would be best suited for growing in such a climate. At this point there were already a few plants they could grow on an industrial scale. This is a cereal called salcam. It usually grows in the desert regions of the southern continent. It is a very hardy plant that can grow in difficult conditions, and it will survive here. The headman regretfully confirmed the fact that they were buying grain from Lord Sarl. He explained that they could not do otherwise. Nothing grew on this land. They gave him in exchange salt and ore, which they extracted from the mines. And Adonis heard that their exchange could not be called equal. This was indeed the case, buying for less than half the market price. He was taking advantage of the village's inability to be self-sufficient, and selling them food for double the price. With such conditions, this village simply could not prosper. Even though their village was so far away, the lord still interfered heavily in their lives. Even the village headman was appointed by the kingdom all this time. Instead of running the village and letting it prosper, they only followed orders from the kingdom. Once the villagers tried to sell their goods in another country, but they quickly got wind of everything and did terrible things. Adonis concluded that this village was a convenient place to exile those undesirable to the crown, so they were simply prevented from developing. But Adonis assured him that he was not. He was going to build a huge city here, and their village would be its foundation. It seemed more like a dream to Luke. Many people tried to challenge the Lord, and all were executed. The headman is very afraid that it will happen again this time. Adonis said to rely on him. He will be able to protect both the people and the whole village from the whole kingdom. They will be able to gain independence. All those days of slave labor, the unjustly executed villagers, the village that was purposely crushed and prevented from developing. Luke couldn't wait for it to end. He was confident that this prince would set things right. A wagon carrying an important person was headed for the village. The man was perplexed that he traveled to this god-forsaken village every month. He had no choice, for Lord Dohao had demanded special attention, to confirm once again that nothing had changed there. And last month, and the month before, and 10 years from now, nothing will have changed. Melma's is a village that will never change. Everything has been done to make the village starve and not develop. If there is even the slightest hint of improvement or hope in that village, they immediately suppress it and get rid of the headman. Heading there from the fortress city of Salyard, emissary Raould called it a waste of time. His partner was the first to spot the water that stretched along the village. Upon discovering the canal, Raould could not believe his eyes. He sensed something wrong, for no one cared about him. Scotia sensed the arrival of the emissary. It was the signal for action. A messenger of the despotic Salyarda entered the office with a heap of indignation. He demanded an explanation of the reason for the presence of water. Raould recognized Prince Adonis and looked as if he had seen a ghost. The emissary did not understand what was happening, for the prince had been banished. For him it should be tantamount to a death sentence. Did anyone in the capital know that he was still alive? Adonis said that the previous headman had died in an accident, so they appointed Mr. Luke as the new headman in a hurry. Mr. Luke's candidacy was approved by him. Adonis was still alive and maintained his position as the third prince. Luke explained the decision he had made with the village. They wanted to give full support to Prince Adonis and his mission to develop the land. As such, the headman was contemplating reconsidering the nature of their relationship with Baron Dohao. First of all, they would completely change the terms of trade in salt and iron ore. After all, no matter what they said, they had previously been forced to sell them to them almost for food. The emissary did not expect to hear such a thing. He reminded him that this contract between the village and Salyard had been passed down from generation to generation, and a boy like him had no right to change its terms unilaterally. That was why Luke had told him that he was breaking this contract. Raould couldn't let this boy ruin everything. If he made him and all of Salyard his enemies, how would he get provisions if they refused him? To this the headman replied that the matter was already being dealt with in cooperation with Prince Adonis. They are experimenting with growing crops on the outskirts of the village. It is likely that they will be able to grow enough for subsistence, so there was no longer any reason for them to continue buying overpriced provisions from them. And naturally, in the future they would find buyers who would take their ore and salt at a price that suited everyone. Raould regarded this as Prince Adonis' interference in the politics of land management. It seems the emissary was unaware that his father had told him to develop the lands of Draglake, and he was doing as he was commanded. Besides, even if you were a baron 10 times over, a dishonest contract of sale is simply unacceptable. After all, innocent people suffer from it afterwards. Luke added that in the future, the village of Milmas would assist Prince Adonis in developing the lands of Draglake. In other words, they are subject to the direct will of the king, and will get rid of any hindrance that could prevent this. That was the conclusion he and the prince came to. The headman asked him to convey his words to Baron Dachau. The emissary gritted his teeth. He took it as spitting him and Mr. Dohao right in the face. The banished prince would be swatted down by the rest of the royal family soon anyway. What's the point of him holding on to him? The headman of the border village can't put conditions on him. In his opinion, it's disgusting. Luke suggested ending their conversation at this point and asked them to leave the room. Raoul snorted that he would have left himself. He was going to take revenge for the impertinence they had allowed themselves by recalling what had happened 5 years ago. Luke remembered it all perfectly well, for they had killed his father then, and he would never forgive them for that. The malcontent was certain that they would all be put to the stake, including Prince Adonis. He was going to return to Sallard immediately. Raoul's partner reported the discovery of grain fields on the outskirts of the village. There was also something that looked like a water channel. The two men were up to something. The next morning, the headman worriedly informed the prince of the problems with the field and the fountain. Someone had broken the fountain and then covered the water with cattle dung. A couple of people drank the water, and Scotia was already in the process of treating them. Adonis assigned Tiamat to purify the water. In just a few moments she restored both the water and the fountain itself. The boys discovered that the field was strewn with salt taken from a warehouse. Someone had broken the deadbolt on the door. If it was covered with salt, the soil is spoiled. Nothing can grow on it anymore. Adonis saw that someone was deliberately spoiling everything and guessed what was wrong. He felt great rage at the pest who had destroyed the fruits of all the effort the boys had put into the soil. Most likely the culprit was Raoul. It was at night, so Grant was the only one who discovered it. The knight felt guilty. Before he could come running, the culprit had already fled. The prince held no grudge against him, considering it his fault. The headman, on the other hand, felt that he should have seen it coming, knowing the kind of man he was. In any case, Adonis did not expect such an inhumane act. He instructed Grant to gather a troop of volunteers from the village. They needed guards. The prince wanted him to train them in basic weapons skills. Grant only didn't know where they could get weapons. For that, Adonis said to go to Iggy. Her wooden weapons should be enough for them. The prince suggested they leave the land and start plowing the soil elsewhere. He left the choice of location to them. And we need to talk to the villagers. They must be very worried. Adonis will need Luke's help. The headman inquired as to what the prince would be doing. Apparently, he was going to pay him back. The guards at Salarda had been greatly increased. Most likely they were defending themselves in case Adonis decided to sneak into the city. No other changes were observed. But on the road connecting north and south, for whatever reason, trade has stalled. They say there's a monster somewhere on that side. Did the monsters activate because the Dragon King's power was awakened? The fate of the world has begun to move and there's nothing they can do about it. They need to create a line of defense before the monsters appear on the doorstep of their settlement. Iggy thought that their village is protected thanks to the Dragon King, but other places clearly won't be fun. Sallard's army might have come before the monsters. Adonis didn't think they would leave them alone, and if the capital found out he was alive, they would send assassins after him. The prince's defenders took it seriously. Tiamat thought it would be easier to kill Raoul before he did, but constantly killing messengers wouldn't work. It was only a matter of time before he let the royal family know that Adonis was alive. He might have already sent someone. The prince thought they could negotiate with him. The boys were ready to do his bidding. Looking into those confident faces, Adonis began a strategy meeting. Scotia provided the map he had asked her for. He instructed Grant and Luke to protect the villagers. Next, they need to build a defense line. First of all, Adonis wanted Iggy to surround the village from the outside with roots. The roots should surround the entire village and their base, just in case if someone walked over them, they would know about it right away. Then the prince wanted water to surround them. There they would place a water monster that would protect them from attacks. Iggy suggested the tree people as creatures that could disguise themselves as plants. Most of the time they stand still like normal trees, but if need be, they can move just as well as humans. They will place them among the trees so the enemy will not suspect anything. To keep them from getting bored, the boys will also act as they fight. He wanted Territ to infiltrate Sallard to spy on Raoul and Dohao and gather information. No need to kill yet. Depending on the situation, Adonis might need to go to Sallard as well. In order to do so, he would need to make preparations. He wanted to create more opportunities to negotiate with Dohao. And for the negotiations, Iggy and Tiamat would go with him. Salard was in the center of the main road connecting north and south. Trade flourished here. It is an important city for the future of Drag Lake. Back in Salard, Raoul reported his successful sabotage. Dohao was pleased with the situation in the village. Now they would dig up all the ground and the groundwater would rise, the manure would mix with the water, and they would all be finished. Raoul tried hard to assure him that now they didn't stand a chance. The banished little brat should know his place. Dohao rarely saw him in a rage. There was nothing to worry about, he thought. They have nothing. That land is barren, nothing will grow on it. Not crops, not people, not ambition. Raoul mentioned the contract he had made. Not having inquired about it earlier, Dohao became enraged. He demanded to know what kind of contract had been made with his family. If the contract is terminated, they will not need their food because they will become self-sufficient. Salt and ore could be sold elsewhere. Raoul asked him not to be angry, trying to convey that otherwise he would not have known that that village was hiding an exiled prince. They decided to summon the sting of the black scorpion to punish the backwater village for treason. Dohao didn't understand why Adonis couldn't sit still and be glad to be alive. For this he would repay with death. The boys adapted to the problematic soil by finding a suitable plant. The ice grass absorbed salt from the ground and crystallized it on its leaves. The leaves and stems were edible and looked very beautiful. Adonis saw this as a great opportunity to sell it to the aristocrats at a high price. Luke considered him a true role model. A local resident wondered if it would be able to grow further when all the salt was absorbed. The prince thought, when all the salt is taken out of the soil, go back to cereals. There should be no more problems growing them. The women got a lot of motivation. When the soil was ruined by salt, Luke thought that was the end of it. He did not expect that this problem could be solved by the power of nature. The boys went to the noise. Grant trained the men to fight. They were very muscular, and they were also very brave and determined as a result of their work in the mines. It would have been nice to teach them archery, but for now we limited ourselves to spears. The tips, of course, are not of the best quality, but the shape is suitable. Adonis wasn't going to use the villagers in battle, but it was better to train them anyway. Grant continued training. The prince saw how energetic they were. Most of the people here had lost their families or suffered at the hands of Lord Dohao. Luke was given papers on several candidates to whom they could sell the ore. The work was done by Tarot and Adonis was proud of his subordinates. The headman ventured to ask if the prince intended to make the village independent of the kingdom. This turned out to be the case. Luke reasoned that he was then essentially the head and symbol of their village. It seemed to him that it would be better to be the headman, not him, but Adonis. The prince is glad that he is the one who is the headman of the village. The locals have a lot of trust in him. He can only lead from behind the scenes. If the village becomes independent, it is natural that Adonis will stand taller, but at least for this village, he would like Luke to be in a leadership position. They will cooperate with him and help each other. Adonis believes that this is the most correct policy. Luke was curious where this would lead. He decided to do his best to live up to his expectations. But to secure their future, something must be done about Lord Dohao. It's not good to leave it to others. Having Adonis protect them with his own forces means that their village will never be exploited again. The large troop of warriors heading toward the backwater village resented the Lord's decision. They realized that they just had to do their job. Whether their target was a single person, an entire town, or a small village, they must do their job. But they didn't like Raoul's activity of handing out his commands. Nothing could be done about it. The Lord put Raoul in command. When the battle begins, a stray arrow might fly at him. The others thought they would make do with a regular massacre. One of the men noticed a tree not typical of these parts. They mistook it for a common tree when it was not. Their aim was to kill men, with special plans for women. As soon as they uttered their talk of massacring Prince Adonis, the tree entered the fray. Following the trees, water was discovered. The lack of a bridge became a problem. Tiamat's dragons emerged from the water. The bandits were confused at the sight of the huge creatures and were destroyed. After the successful massacre, the dragons lurked in the water again. The ranks of the enemy thinned. The enemy lurked in their tents, not waiting for the scouts to return. The conversation revealed that 500 mercenaries had been hired to ravage the village, which looked more like a war. Raoul vigorously argued to his interlocutor that they could not fail here, and that they must capture Prince Adonis, shuddering at the Lord's orders. The interlocutor understood this perfectly well. But why so many people to capture a prince who doesn't even have a proper guard? Raoul explained it was because of Lord Dohao's order. The interlocutor decided to send more scouts. Gasinia, one of the members of the Black Scorpion Sting, threatened him. He could not allow himself to be treated like that. thinking that the Lord would turn a blind eye to his death if the village was destroyed, and he saw no point in dragging it out this long. If Raoul was afraid to go on the attack, he let him stay here. He'd sworn loyalty to the Lord, and it sickened him when anyone else dared to order him about. Raoul promised to do everything with his own hands and gave the order to depart. Gassigna thought it was possible to dispense with strategy. They are the hunters and the villagers are the prey. It's just a mockery of the weak. The young men eagerly asked to be allowed to defend the village. Grant could not give a definite answer. Tiamat understood perfectly their desire to protect the house. She said that they could go with her, then nothing terrible would happen and Grant would feel more comfortable. Tiamat's suggestion was very logical. She told the boys to get ready to punish the enemy who had encroached on the Lord's lands. Tiamat didn't think the enemy would reach the village, but there were clearly more of them than they had realized. Grant asked that Prince Adonis be warned of this first. Next he said about fortifying the gates of the village. Adonis had no doubt that they would be safe with Tiamat. He knew the approximate location of the hardest battle. Iggy was going to head south of the battlefield, where the enemy would try to outflank them, and Scotia to the north. The village was left to Luke. Everything was leading up to the start of a serious battle. There was no turning back anymore. The bandits encountered trees, creepy monsters they were seeing for the first time. Some of them voluntarily launched fire, which was an excellent weapon against the trees, trailing the warriors. Gassigna did not regard them as his people. He saw only walking trees that they could not handle, so he did their work. In his eyes they were only cannon fodder. He was going to go from the north, and he sent Raoul to the south. Raoul reminded him that he should give the orders here, and suggested just attacking head-on. Gassigna thought his tactics were useless. They will set the main forces to defend the main gate, so there is no reason for the bandits to go there. And if anything, the prince will try to escape either from the south side or the north side. Therefore, they must detain him. Raoul understood his train of thought. He commanded to follow him to strike from the south. The bandits left the burning forest with the purpose of storming the gate. The enemy found a protective barrier around the village, but found a way to cross the water. Right there Tiamat was waiting for them, and with her a harnessed monster. No sooner had they raised their shields than suddenly the archers fired from another position. The bandits' main objective was still to cross the bridge, so they decided to ignore the woman. Tiamat advised them not to ignore her, for they would still fail. She skillfully calculated the next steps while thinking about Grant and the villagers. The Dragon Princess decided to massacre those who did not dare to cross the bridge. She used the water elemental, taking them by surprise. Racing toward the gate, the bandits continued to follow the plan no matter what. The enemy horses were hit by skillful archers. Grant realized that Tiamat had missed them on purpose. The leading troop took him on, and ordered the others to take care of the villagers. The knight was surprised she hadn't warned him, leaving someone strong or he wouldn't even have time to warm up. They stared into each other's eyes against the backdrop of a desperate battle. Before attacking, Grant asked for his name, but the bandit did not give his victims a name. With that, the knight sprang into action. The bandit tried to humiliate his opponent by calling his blows weak. Grant then decided to make him regret his words. With a new run, it became harder for the bandit to fend off his attacks, each blow getting harder and harder. Grant revealed to him his heavy blows skill. The more punches he throws, the stronger they become. If he couldn't defeat him with one blow, he lost. His disciples also excelled on the battlefield. Grant was setting the boys up for the likelihood of the next opponent's arrival so that they would not relax. The warriors spread out into positions. Knight, remembering the plan, thought that most likely no one else would come. The bandits were captured by tree roots on another front. In the depths of the forest lurked Iggy and Scotia. Scotia couldn't wait her turn, confident that no one could escape Iggy's forests, unless it was a very lucky person. She became convinced that their magic was abnormal. That's how much magic power it takes to cast such large-scale spells. Humans' magic is simply inefficient. Do they use it differently? Iggy had a hard time explaining it. People didn't understand its true nature, and those who did understand were very few in history. The only survivor showed up, which turned out to be Raoul. He tried to ask for help and prove that he had been forced onto this battlefield. The girls could not make up their minds about his fate. Not intending to wait, he wordlessly pointed his weapon at them. His desire to deal with them was the signal for action, and the girls simultaneously cast spells. The deadly attack left him no chance. Scotia hoped that Prince Adonis could handle it alone. Iggy didn't doubt him. Scotia had no idea how strong he was. Gassinji's squad was destroyed by Adonis. The bandit couldn't believe his defeat and asked who he was. The prince spoke his name, and also called himself the Dragon King, that he would rule Draglake. The bandits found themselves surrounded by monsters and dragons. Gassania had to choose between escaping or continuing the battle. He smiled slyly, finding the prince unaccompanied, also carrying a staff. The boy inquired as to his next course of action. Would he run away or would he fight? If they decide to run away, he will let go. Gassania remarked that he had too long a tongue for an exiled prince, and it was he who should beg for mercy. He was going to capture him first and then entertain the locals. Adonis ordered silence. He wanted to hear why he wanted to do this. Gassania attacked with magical power. The prince impressed him by repelling the attack. The bandit rejoiced, believing the mage to be much weaker than himself. He behaved like the leader of the mercenaries. As they had anticipated, he attacked from here. Everything was going according to their plan. The earth began to shake under the influence of a mysterious force. A powerful dragon formed from the surface and moved confidently into its jaws. Gassania overestimated his skills, receiving a serious rebuff. The leader thought that his skill of resisting magic would work, but his strength was not yet exhausted, and he prepared for another attack. Suddenly, the man felt an obstacle that prevented him from moving. He was bogged down in a swamp, and it was impossible to get out of it. He desperately tried to save himself with the spell-breaking skill, but it was powerless here as well. Adonis explained that he had purposely created the swamp here by using water, so there was no way for him to get out. Gassania refused to believe that it was possible to master the magic of several elements at once. The prince called it dragon power. The bandit didn't understand why monsters obeyed him or why he could use such power. The last thing he heard was the name of Adonis, the dragon king that rules Draglake, and the rightful ruler. It was hard for the lad to realize the death made by his hands, but there was nothing to be done about it. It was for the safety of the village. The unpleasant news reached the king. Baran explained that he was busy fighting monsters on the western border, so he decided to hire mercenaries as usual to deal with him. But he was not satisfied with their work. There was no way he thought they would fail, nor did he know that Adonis would be able to fight back against the mercenary sting of the Black Scorpion. The king's explanation was that he had used them to solve the country's internal problem without making sure of their competence. Prince Keel offered to send him there, believing he could handle any opponent. The king decided that he would take on the monsters on the western border. If any monster leader appeared there, there would be no escape. He told Baran to do something at least, allowing him to use the army. Baran was not sure if the soldiers would not hesitate to point their weapons at the third prince. The king recalled the monsters that had appeared all over the continent once they banished him, so the intelligence also reported that the monsters obeyed him. Baran was amazed at the guess that Adonis was the one who summoned the monsters. In that case, he is the demon king, and this reason should be enough. The king ordered to lead an army and get rid of the new demon king, and until then not to return. Baran hated his brother with all his heart, managing to cause so much trouble even when he wasn't around. The boys traveled to Salard. It had been a long time since the Dragon Princess had walked around a city with so many people on the streets. She usually only destroyed them. Adonis liked cities like this too. They held hands. The girl had heard that the locals thought of him as a demon king, but he was a dragon king. The guy felt it unnecessary to correct that. He doubted that Lord Doha would settle down so easily. His precious army had been destroyed, and he was surely angry. Therefore, they need to study the situation. Adonis wished he would leave them alone. After confidently stating that they would strike back if attacked, Iggy stopped. She inquired as to his next course of action. Adonis planned to develop the lands of Draglake, to explore, to free the village of Milmuse from the Lord's exploitation, and perhaps to create an independent country. Iggy made him wonder if this was really what he desired. She had seen many dragon kings and had looked up to those like him who put too much on themselves. They operated on mere logic, trying to do what was best for others. But did he really want that for himself? The princess wanted him to be happy. She asked him to say what he really wanted and why he wanted to create an independent country. Adonis admitted that he didn't want to evolve, he would rather just run away. He realized that even if someone challenged them, he had Iggy and Tiamat. But was it right to use their power? That was why she was asking what he really wanted to do. That was something he hadn't even thought about. With the power of a dragon king, you can change the world. But if you change the world, it will involve a lot of sacrifices. And that's such a huge weight on one person's shoulders. Iggy thought that if he wasn't capable of making sacrifices, he'd better not start. The guy remembered all the people who had died because of him. He agreed with Iggy. It was like it was happening to someone else. He had already killed so many people by blaming someone else. Adonis didn't know what was right or wrong. and it was the first time he'd ever killed someone with his own hands. So he justified his actions by saying that he was doing it for someone else. He realized how wrong he was. The princess asked repeatedly what he really wanted. Thoughts of comrades always ready to support him flashed through his mind. Adonis didn't know if he was fit, but he would become king. He didn't want to use the power of the Dragon King to destroy, so he would create his own country where humans and dragon princesses could live in peace, and he would protect that world. This is exactly how he wanted to use the power given to him. Adonis did not want to take revenge on his family. If there was a way out without fighting, it was better not to shed blood. And even if there was no way out, he would try to find one. Iggy supported the lad in this, deeming him more than worthy of wielding this power. Adonis is the Dragon King, and they will follow him. The prince was grateful to Yggdrasil. Now he understood everything. The power of dragon princesses could be used not only for destruction but also for creation. And he was the first to treat a dragon princess like a child. With determination, he continued to move toward his goal. Adonis became an uninvited guest at Lord Dohao's house. If he had known he was the banished prince, he would never have granted this audience. He didn't like the boy putting himself above him. Adonis began by saying that Dohao was one of the rulers of this region, but his unilateral treaty with the village of Milmas could be called trivial exploitation. That he sent his agent there was unacceptable. He even sent an army to ravage it. As Draglake's representative, Adonis came to demand an apology and compensation. Dohao could not allow him to interfere with the treaty that had been made every generation. Everything about the attack he attributed to Raoul's will. Adonis could not believe that such a man ruled such a large city. He declared that Dohao was in charge, and he should be responsible for the actions of his subordinates. He was as responsible for their actions as he was for his own. The Lord felt that it was the prince who should make up for the huge losses. Dai realized that the negotiations had broken down and they would not find a solution. Dohao was not going to negotiate with the exiled prince. Adonis calmly replied that he was no longer a prince. He is the ruler of a new independent country in the land of Draglake. King of the Dragon Kingdom of Draglake, that's what he called it. The Lord didn't think the kingdom of Krondeg would let him. Adonis understood this and would be happy to welcome the Dohao region to his kingdom. If he agreed, they would find common ground with him. Everything seemed suspiciously simple, in a way that the Lord refused to believe his words. Adonis knew it wouldn't be easy, but if he didn't try, the dream would remain just a dream. Dohao saw it as treason against the kingdom and felt it was his duty to stop him. He thought that the main force might not be needed because he would just kill him here, and the story would end. Adonis realized where he was going and prepared himself. All the local guards were too weak. Tarot got rid of all of them. She also gathered all the documents. They were the reports on the dispatch of the mercenaries and the orders to destroy the village, signed by the Lord's hand. The orders were to kill all the men in the village, sell the women and children into slavery, take all the remaining resources and find new laborers for the local mines. He would say this was the worst way to solve the problem. Adonis signaled to Iggy as Dohao swung his fist. Plant roots coiled along his liquid body, leaving no chance of escape. It made a nice bush. Iggy didn't kill him, he just became nutrient for the parasite's tree. Adonis suggested transplanting it elsewhere and asked Tarot about the next lord. She learned that this city had found the right person who understood the limits of the region and saw opportunities for development. The head of the trade guild was the right person. Adonis trusted her judgment and asked to be introduced to him. Tarot asked to be given some time. As for the army from the kingdom, she would gather the necessary information. Prince Baran was busy with work, so she doubted that the army would do anything for a month. And when the army finally started moving, it would take them at least a week to reach here. Leaving Tarot in town, the boys returned to the base. They summarized that things had gotten even more complicated. With Iggy and Tiamat's power, they could grow any crops they wanted, but if they used too much magic, they would be unusable. It would still have to be grown by their own power. They still had time before the army from the kingdom arrived. They need to accumulate as much combat power as possible. As for food, Adonis would like to completely provide for themselves. Scotia cited finding suitable soil as the most difficult task. With water and temperature, they could always do something. Iggy remembered Yorochka, whom Adonis had first heard of. Jormungand was the dragon guardian of the serpent. She was also Iggy's twin sister. The boy looked around the area around him, hoping not to catch anyone. The girls claimed that Yorochka was humble and very different. Adonis didn't believe them. He cast a summoning spell. With each syllable, the power grew, and pillars of light began to swirl around him, weaving into complex patterns. The ground beneath his feet trembled. The ancient beast awoke, releasing itself from the soil. The dragon finally emerged into the light and could open its eyes again. He stuck his snout out and looked at the boys. Iggy was the first to say hello to her sister. Adonis introduced himself and invited her to take human form. The girl was in reality a carbon copy of her sister. Feeling stiff, she asked to be called simply Yor, but if he didn't like it, it could be otherwise. Adonis was also satisfied with the first option. Iggy was beyond delighted. Compared to her, Yor was acting more modestly. Adonis was going to take her to their base. They would also prepare a separate room for her, but the sisters would be more comfortable living in the same room. They were getting along fine as always. The last time they met, Tiamat had lost to them when they fought two of them against her alone. But she put that behind her. Scotia was once again convinced that the power of dragons was amazing. Yor asked if they didn't need to bury some city in the sand or split the earth for the enemy army to fail. Scotia was sure that the time would come when such a thing would have to be done. The dragon princesses possessed great power that should serve for the benefit of others. They would also use their power for defense and offense, but it was very rare. Fire, water, and earth magic, all of which should primarily be used for the sake of the people, not as a tool of war. Scotia realized that it sounded naive, but she would still follow him. Yor got a little frank, saying that unlike her sisters, she didn't really like to fight, but she liked that kind of thing. Then they would try their best together. To make their country stronger, it would need to be able to provide its own food. Yor inquired where her brother and the others were now. Scotia could find no words to describe their occupation. They were dealing with the cows. The cows took the form of powerful beings set against humans. Yesterday was fine, and today they showed up here. The people in the business had made hay to feed the cattle. The cows had recently eaten it all. Scotia was surprised to learn that they had eaten it all in just a few days. Adonis guessed that the reason was to speed up the growth of the grass with magic. The vast stores of magical power caused mutations within the bodies of the cows, and this is what came out in the end. Grant asked if they could call it evolution. Adonis thought they would probably be interested in Scotia. In any case, they couldn't feed the village without them. He asked to keep them for him. The monsters felt the power emanating from him. Adonis tried out the dragon clothes skill. The monsters fought for freedom and were about to destroy the tyrant. Adonis only needed a touch of his hand to steal him. The power was all in the skill. He temporarily gained the power of the dragon and increased his physical abilities. The monster refused to negotiate. Then Adonis provided him with an easy flight into the sky. Sensing his helplessness, the leader apologized. Now they were ready to talk. He landed in a pile of intertwined roots. The monster recognized his immense strength, but in that strength he felt sadness. He is a tyrant, after all. Adonis did not see himself as such. The bull decided that in that case they would find common ground. Witnesses to the reconciliation wondered if the cows would become normal again. Suddenly they were told that the pigs and chickens had suddenly grown up and were talking. The new ruler of Salier was officially determined. Terran made it quick. Thanks to her, they were able to establish normal trade. In addition to food, they bought iron weapons. They have their own iron, but no technology to process it. The units were already organized. They were recruiting more and more people into the self-defense forces. Adonis felt the need to train the forces faster. He did not want to use the princesses for war. Grant was going to tell him something else. Adonis was afraid that it was about Mr. Bull, who was rampaging again. The knight was talking about weapons. They were too strong. Human weapons constantly broke in their hands, and it was impossible to give up such potential fighting power. Then Adonis had an idea. Yor had told him that the Dragon Princess of Fire was a master blacksmith. Maybe she could make weapons for them. Grant wondered if it was possible to summon one after another so quickly. Kalissa had told Adonis about it. Yor got along well with Scotia. They certainly liked each other. Adonis remembered that Tiamat had said that the fiery one had a very complicated temperament. When he gained strength, he would summon her. Grant told him not to be in too much of a hurry, but if they can work iron with her, it will be a huge leap for their kingdom. Although they couldn't call it a kingdom yet, the village was getting bigger. Also, Adonis had finally decided to rule his kingdom. Grant could see that he had gained confidence in himself. Soon it was time for the summoning of one of the dragon princesses, Kagutsuchi. Adonis, having cast the spell, froze in anticipation. Mana condensed in the air, forming a vortex, drawing in sparks of light and shadow. As he waited for a miracle, he looked around. Suddenly, his attention was caught by something small. It was a light encased in a sphere. Adonis called Kagutsuchi's name. The dragon princess was not much pleased by the call, preferring sweet sleep. Adonis explained his intentions to her. He wanted her power. He wanted her to use her flame for the sake of his country. But he realized it wasn't that simple. He wasn't going to go against her will. Guy offered to talk so she could make a decision. In response, all he heard was a long snore. Adonis startled her when he was surprised that she had fallen asleep. The princess thought he wanted to use her for destruction. Kagutsuchi thought that all humans were equally bent on destroying each other and could not understand them. Adonis decided that it made her angry. She had to use her power to kill. He promised not to use her power for such purposes. He suddenly thought about the fact that making weapons and armor was in some ways also indirect killing. The boy explained that his country was in danger and in order to defend it, they needed weapons. Weapons created by human hands are no match for the hands of half-humans. Kagutsuchi became interested in this. Adonis had heard from Tiamat and the others that she was good at blacksmithing. That was what he needed her fire for. He wanted her flame to create, and the princess trusted him. She took on human form and gave her name, Kagutsuchi, the very essence of the flame embodied in feminine grace. Adonis accepted her trust with a sense of sincere joy. Having made a successful summoning, he took her to the forge. Kagutsuchi appreciated the iron ore in stock. Luke would be willing to sell it if it was that good. After all, they didn't have the technology to process it. Kagutsuchi believed that if Jormungand was already here, it would work out. She would be able to make do with the tools they already had. But first asked her to tell her what kind of weapons they needed so she would understand what she needed to do. With Kagutsuchi's help, their weapons issue was solved. Now they would be ready for war. Adonis mentioned the finishing touches that needed to be done. Yor was changing the landscape by erecting new elevations. Scotia thought this was madness, but Adonis expected it would delay the arrival of the kingdom's army by a couple more days. A thought flashed through her mind about the likelihood of their plan being discovered by magical trails. Taking the risk, Adonis understood the need to intimidate the enemy. Panic had been sown in the palace. The knight reported a tectonic movement near Salyard. According to scouts, the road to Salyard was now unusable, and the army would not arrive there until a week later. Varan could not make the same mistake twice. He ordered that even the smallest detail should not be overlooked and that the area should be studied on a wide perimeter. This was followed by a report of a powerful magical force detected in the eastern part of Drag Lake. A bunch of mountains and forests that hadn't been there before appeared all around. Varan guessed that this was the work of Adonis. Wasn't the Dragon King some kind of trash skill? And now he was controlling monsters and changing the landscape. Could Adonis, who had no talent for magic at all, do such a thing? The mages suddenly reported the discovery of a group of monsters. They were moving from the western mountains where Keel had only recently finished his trek. There had been too much information about the monsters in the west lately, and Baran's suspicions all fell on his younger brother. He ordered to find out more information about the monsters from the west. Something monstrous was going on in the west as he prepared to deal with the monster lord. The monsters were rapidly approaching the capital without much resistance. After all, they had been told of the Dragon King's awakening. It turned out that he had gone out of the country, so they had to seize the opportunity to deal with him before he returned. The princess hadn't fully awakened yet, and they had to hurry. The mysterious girl stopped on the cliff. Her face was hidden by a deep hood, but even through this veil, one could feel a focused gaze staring at the capital. The stranger was finally able to get in here. It was much worse than her homeland. She had high hopes for this country because she was told that the Dragon King lived here. The castle seemed unsightly and there was little entertainment. She was already bored here, but it was early to leave, so she had to entertain herself somehow. But it would be problematic if they found her. They would definitely drag her back, and she didn't want that. The girl suffered from the fact that no one wanted to understand her. She looked at the people living peacefully in her country and realized that everything here could be destroyed. Her first step in invading the continent was to take over this kingdom. At that time, Adonis and his subordinates were discussing their strategy. Guy felt a strange and previously familiar aura emanating from the direction of the door. The conversation was interrupted by Kalissa, who solemnly entered the office. Pleased with the witch, Adonis hastily rose from his chair. Kalissa had time to look around Salyard and his village, which had become good towns. He had even planted a nice bush there. He was getting stronger every day and she praised him for it. Adonis called it their common merit. Kalissa hastened to tell him that she had no time to talk. He was to return to the capital as Dragon King to settle his conflict with the local king. He is the king of another country and should at least know of its existence. Kalissa was about to voice another reason for him to go to the capital. Krondake was being invaded from the west. Adonis knew that there was nothing but water in the west, only an unbridgeable sea, so he didn't understand what country could have invaded from there. The witch's assumptions fell on the empire. Scotia remembered that it was the country that owned the islands to the west. Kisanogi Empire. Once upon a time long ago, they had invaded the continent, commanding an army of monsters, and started a great war. She had learned it from the history books, and it turned out to be true. They led a horde of monsters and crossed an insurmountable sea, and they want to invade the continent again. The situation was complicated by their ability to control the monsters. The recent activity of the monsters was probably due to them. Kalisa stated that Adonis had something to do with it, since he was the Dragon King and had to suppress these monsters somehow. She didn't have time to elaborate. All she could tell him now was that he was the shield that protected this world from the threat of the Empire. Adonis suddenly wondered if his father knew that his skill was created to fight the Empire. As Kalisa suggested, it was quite obvious evidence of ignorance that the prince had been banished, though he should have known. She thought the reason lay in his brothers, and it was because of them that things had gone wrong. He should have gone back to the capital and learned the truth. Tarot entered the office with bad news. The situation in the capital was tense. A horde of monsters was invading the kingdom from the west. They were moving towards the capital. If they continued at this pace, they would be there in a few days. The capital was now in chaos. There was no way the king and the princess could coordinate their actions, and the soldiers were not working together. The guys were worried about the common people and felt terrible that they couldn't do anything. That was why Kalisa was saying that there was no time. Having said everything necessary, the girl was about to leave Adonis. She had her own things to do. Worried about the people, Adonis decided to go to the capital. But it was dangerous for him to go there alone. Kalisa suggested taking the princess with him, then there shouldn't be any problems. The guy made the decision to go there with the princess and Tarot. He entrusted Grant and Scotia and the rest of the princesses to prepare for the monster attack on Saliard and Milmuse, while he entrusted Tarot with the preparations to go to the capital. Seeing the glint of determination in his eyes, Kalisa realized that he had clearly matured and become more like a Dragon King. In front of her now stood a man whose strength was not only for the defense of his country, but also for the defense of the entire world. He was no longer just a prince, he had become a warrior, a leader, a hope. Adonis may not have fully realized the full weight on his shoulders yet, but he wanted to be the king who created his country. He would create a kingdom where everyone was equal and lived in safety. Kalisa smiled. Seeing the firmness of his intentions, she thought about believing him this time. Before she left, Adonis decided to ask what she was doing all this for. After thinking a little about the answer, Kalisa replied that it was for peace, hoping that such an answer would satisfy him. The princess he had taken with him was surprised that he had taken her specifically. In his opinion, no one would be better suited than Kagutsuchi. In her heart, the girl rejoiced. Adonis also remarked that if they did have to fight, he could minimize the damage with her. Remembering the other princesses, she agreed with him. Memories of their first meeting and the words he had said then flashed through her mind. He had no intention of using her flame in battle. He was indeed an interesting Dragon King. But when he was in trouble, he would use her power. The boys heard screams piercing the streets of the city. They encountered the first monster about to attack the defenseless girl. Guy imprisoned it in a root spear that flashed with bright light, finally restraining the monster. The rescued girl showered the mage with words of gratitude. The hood no longer hid her face, and she introduced herself. Her name was Shin. Sheen endlessly peppered him with questions about his name and why he was here. Kagutsuchi firmly stated their goal was to meet the king. Then Shin wondered who Adonis, seemingly serious at first glance, was. Adonis explained that in this country, once a month even a commoner could get an audience. He has come to meet the king as a representative of a village not far from here. In fact, he didn't lie to her. Shin offered to go together under the pretext of her meeting with the king. She couldn't give the exact reason, but she eventually confirmed his hunch to ask for an audience. The girl decided to make haste with it. Adonis couldn't believe that monsters had infiltrated right into the center of the city. He earnestly addressed her. The guy asked her a question about whether she had seen such monsters. Shin claimed that she had encountered them here for the first time. She was suddenly frightened, realizing that there were more monsters here. But Adonis was glad that she hadn't seen them here yet, so they still had time. Kagutsuchi advised her not to lose it so easily. Tarot's silhouette emerged from the darkness of the narrow alleyway as she finished her preparations. She inquired about the girl they had managed to meet. Shin gave her name and introduced herself as an ordinary girl who had been rescued by Adonis. She didn't like being ignored. The guy asked Tarot to bear with her for a while. Meanwhile, the king, emptying a bottle of wine, quietly collapsed on his couch. Memories of what had happened about a decade ago came to mind. In the midst of all this painting were two silhouettes familiar to him. The woman to whom the boy was cuddled, one just like his mother. Peel and Baran hurriedly informed their father about the monsters that had already taken over the second city on the western border. Moreover, the slain people had turned into bloodthirsty ghosts. The enemy was only getting stronger. They rushed their father to take some measures to protect the kingdom. The king was completely indifferent to the disaster. The boys could not understand their father's actions, but he recognized their inability to stop the onslaught. He considered them useless. They kept insisting on the need to speed up, because with each passing second, the monsters were getting one step closer to the capital. Baran's detection magic found where the monsters were now. Keel suggested trying to squeeze their forces with his and his father's units. Taking a sip of wine from the bottle, he noisily placed it on the table and grinned. He noticed that until recently they had been willing to cut each other's throats, but now they were working together. He declared that he did not need their help and would do everything alone. They tried to convey to him how powerful these monsters were, that they had taken over their well-defended city in the west in just half a day. Not only were they outnumbered, they couldn't even match them in physical power, which meant that they would inevitably reach the capital. Keel reached a boiling point when he suggested asking Adonis for help. King thought himself capable of more than Adonis. He was not about to give up. Keel understood what he thought of him. He might have thought him useless, but if the scouts' reports were to be believed, they had to recognize the fact that his skill was amazing. As soon as he left their country, mobs of monsters swooped down on them. The sage had warned them about this, and he was still their family. Everything could start over. The king laughed at that last sentence. They had been trying to kill each other all this time. What kind of family could they be talking about? Or were they only playing family when it benefited them? The king also knew that Mina's murder was done by their hands. He knew everything. They, the sons of the first queen, detested the second queen, the mother of Adonis, for she gave her love only to Adonis. They were jealous. Keel said in his defense that only Baranus was involved. It was an accident. The king began by saying that Mina had a mysterious power. She had saved him many times. That's why he took her as his wife and conceived her a child. But because of their animal desires, she was dead, and his son grew up to be an incompetent coward. They didn't understand why. Knowing this, he had done nothing all this time. He felt it was his duty as king to deal with the pain of loss. Yes, he was sad, but he hoped they would be helpful. And in the end, it turned out to be a mistake. To consider them family was beyond the realm of possibility. He decided to take on the army. He didn't care about their actions. In the event of his death they would, as they wished, take his place. Keel said bluntly that he had always wanted to be like the great king. But he had always made a terrible father. Left alone with his thoughts, the king, turning to Mina, wondered where he had taken a wrong turn. The door to the study was ajar again. This time a maid entered, announcing that it was time to speak. He put on his crown again, which gave him even more majesty, and continued to do his royal duty. Tiamat complained that lately the Dragon King wasn't taking her with him at all. In Salyard, he took Iggy with him, and this time he took Kagutsuchi with him while she was bored here. Iggy boasted that they were holding hands with him. To humans, it's a sign that they will never part. This was the first time Tiamat had heard of it. But if it came to negotiation, she was sure that he would take her. Scotia and Yor felt the heavy atmosphere. Iggy doubted it. Instead of negotiating, she would just try to flush out her enemies right away. That was why Adonis didn't take her this time. Tiamat thought it was better to get rid of bad people at once. Besides, Iggy herself was quite the negotiator. She could remind her how things ended in Salyarda, but they still liked it about each other. Yor called it logical that those who would go against Adonis should suffer. It was because of this that he would never take them with him again. That's what she thought. Scotia would never have thought that Yor was so straightforward. Grant inquired about the progress of the Minotaurs. The weapons Kagutsuchi had made for them were perfect for their hands and very sturdy. Grant had no doubts about the Dragon Forge. The Minotaurs believed that with such weapons, they wouldn't lose to anyone, and the strongest beastmen would be them. The orcs reminded themselves. They were amused by the fact that the Minotaurs thought they were the strongest. It looked like they would have to spill blood. The leader of the orcs called them the strongest. They may have been physically weaker, but they were smarter. The Minotaur leader even found it hard to believe that they had evolved with him over the same hay. Grant tried to cool the fervor on both sides. Suddenly someone large and with wings called for them to stop. It was a creature called a cicatris. He had evolved from a rooster just like the rest of the animals. They spoke as if it had lived before Grant. Cicatris reminded them that the weapons were not given to them by Lord Adonis for fighting. They had made him a promise. Both sides recognized that if a strong enemy came to them, that was where they would prove their strength. They understood the importance of working together. Watching the once common animals strive for freedom was quite unusual. The rooster acted as a great motivator, boosting morale. Luke asked Grant how His Highness was doing. He had the Dragon Princess with him, so Grant thought it wouldn't go too badly. Luke was worried about whether there would be monsters. The knight remembered the witch who had come and told him everything. But he didn't deny that the situation was grim. Luke was scared to think what would have happened if His Highness hadn't come to them. The village had only become like this because of him. They were willing to defend what the prince had given them to the end, even if their enemies were monsters. Grant recalled the strategy meeting they would hold in case of anything. After all, they should be strong when the prince is gone. Together, they would definitely defend the village. Luke was confident about protecting the future that Prince Adonis had given them while he was on a difficult mission in the capital. Meanwhile, they continued toward the castle, and Adonis inquired about what was going on inside. Tarot was able to learn that lately, the king was no longer able to unite the aristocrats. Every faction was pulling the blanket on themselves, even the prince factions. And the monster attacks were becoming more and more frequent. Because of this confusion, the people revolted and wanted to hear what the king had to say. But he hadn't done anything yet, and it didn't look like he was going to. It is a matter of time before the people go directly. But even though the monsters were already so far away, no one was doing anything. Besides, Tarot was sure that he also wanted to question the king about many things. Adonis thanked her for creating this opportunity for him. Tarot felt it was her duty. Shin suggested, saying bluntly that she didn't like the praise. This little girl was increasingly annoying Tarot, and only Adonis made her hold back. Kagutsuchi wondered what he would do if the king pointed his sword at him. In that case, they already had a retreat plan. Kagutsuchi saw that Tarot could be trusted. As a last resort, they would have to fight. Sheen began to doubt whether she should still go with them. Kagutsuchi agreed not to kill her if she behaved well, but they didn't yet suspect what lurked behind that sweet and not seemingly harmless smile. It was a mask hiding his true nature, clever, cunning, and incredibly ambitious. The king continued to sit on his throne, tapping his fingers nervously on the armrests. There was an oppressive silence in the hall. The subordinate suggested that the following man be admitted. He was a member of the Synod family. He was probably from some poor aristocratic family. The king without hesitation ordered him to be let in to deal with him quickly. A man appeared at the door, hiding his face under a hood. This was disrespectful to the king. Finally, he boldly showed himself to him. The ruler saw his son, in whom he again recognized his late wife. Her blue-black hair, the tenderness of her gaze, everything spoke of kinship. Remembering his made-up status as a member of the Synod family, the king thought that the boy could have chosen a more appropriate nickname. He looked exhausted, and Tarot realized that he had been guzzling alcohol again. He reminded her that she was still a maid who allowed herself too much. Kagutsuchi joined in her words. He was called a great king, but she saw a boring alcoholic with no ambition. Sheen, on the other hand, decided that insulting the king so head-on was abnormal. The king, seeing Tarot's devotion to her son, realized that she still hadn't let Mina go. Guards quickly surrounded them. Only a few months had passed, and Adonis saw how much his father had aged. He no longer felt that his presence was enough to show the greatness of their kingdom. The king did not like the insolence he was allowing himself. Adonis still sat on his non-existent throne. Adonis responded by saying that unlike him, he had already begun to master the duties of a king. The man considered him unworthy to call himself king. He was now more like his old self. Suddenly, the subordinate, still present in the reception hall, declared that his activities to establish an independent state were punishable by death. In an instant, he was thrown into a cold sweat. He looked at Tarot and Kagutsuchi, ready to avenge the lord's insults. The king was unclear about the nature of his coming. He urged his son to come out clean, guessing that the matter was about Mina. He hastened to report that his mother was dead, and his brothers had a direct hand in it. They were jealous and angry with her and then killed her. Naturally, the king couldn't let this become public knowledge, so he hushed it all up. He had nothing more to tell. After learning the real reason for his mother's death, Adonis felt betrayed. Betrayed by his father, who failed to protect his wife, and by his brothers, whose jealousy turned into tragedy. He did not understand why she died for such a foolish thing. Adonis could not just accept it. He felt contempt for his father, who had told him nothing. The king attributed it to his son's weakness. He had not inherited her abilities and had not lived up to his expectations. Neither his nor Mina's. To some extent, it was also about the Dragon King. Now their country was besieged by hordes of monsters. When Adonis was born, the Demon King was born along with him. Monsters were born. An empire was reborn. He considered it the fault of Adonis. Even though he didn't believe in the Dragon King even before, he realized everything. But it was too late. He had made a huge mistake and realized that he shouldn't have taken Mina with him. She shouldn't have given birth to a child. Suddenly, the heavy door to the hall swung open. The knights rushed to inform the king of the monster's arrival in the capital. The king ran out onto the balcony of his grand palace, his heart pounding with fear and anger. As early as this morning, they were just in Falzen, and they had already reached the capital. Down below, in the streets of the city that had once been full of life and joy, there was now panic. Huge, monster-like shadows loomed over him. The king watched in horror as his city was destroyed by monsters. Adnis, realizing the need to do something to protect the civilians, told his father to send soldiers into the city. He called for unity in the emergency, but the king did not need his help. He said to go to his desert and leave him. Tarot, seeing the firmness of his intentions, realized that it was useless to try to dissuade him. What was happening outside was very unexpected. They could not fight. Adnis understood this, but he could not allow so many innocents to suffer because of the king. Besides, Shin was not near them. Tarot didn't feel her presence near her. She understood the young man's feelings, but right now, all they could do was leave. Adnis also had a people that he must protect. Adnis hoped that he could at least do something about it. Tarot regretted the mistake she had made in training him, but Kagutsuchi saw that it was only for the best. The castle was in chaos. They better not expect any help from the soldiers. Tarot will go in search of Shin. They would evacuate the people as much as possible and meet in Salyarta. The boys believed in saving them. They set out on the mission. Teal, running down the corridor of the castle, was in a hurry to get somewhere. He felt that the entire era of humanity had come to an end. Risking his life in a lost war was pointless. He was going to escape from the capital through the secret passage behind the throne, and in the future he planned to become the new king. Entering the hall, he found no one but a mysterious girl. She was quite beautiful. Shin asked if he knew the Dragon King. Teal thought it was some kind of joke. She made him remember that they were of the same blood, and he was very annoyed by it. She had heard enough. The girl didn't need to know his name, because he would die right now. Fury erupted in his chest, and without thinking, he rushed to attack. His sword flashed through the air, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. Everything happened so fast that before he knew it, he was on the brink of life and death. At the last moment, as the world around him began to dim, he saw a ruthless figure in front of him. It crushed him like an insect. Meanwhile, the knights under the king's command fought desperately against the monsters. Prince Baran had escaped, and they had no more mages left. But the king was not about to die at the clutches of the monsters. His name was Harvey, and he was the ruler, and they would die by his sword. Suddenly, they were attacked by a powerful stream of fire. The fiery attack, like the fury of a volcano, engulfed several monsters. A mocking female voice was heard. Who would have thought that the king himself would lead his soldiers? How she wanted to see him blazing brightly at his end. But he still couldn't cope with the Dragon King. Harvey, looking around, couldn't find the cruel stranger. She was ready to kill him, and he hadn't even made peace with his son. Here even her heart pricked, but he could not worry. His light would not go to waste. Adnis was confronting monsters from another front. There were too many of them. In order for Shin and Tarot to escape, it was necessary to slaughter as many as possible. Kagutsuchi suggested contacting the base. Adnis had already used the dragon call. They needed as many people as possible. They would surely arrive at a crazy speed. Kagutsuchi certainly didn't want to fight, but she understood the situation they were in. She agreed to help a little. A stream of tremendous force knocked them off their feet. They couldn't let their guard down right now. This was something on a whole other level. If it was left as it was, trouble would happen, so they hurried. Adnis should have noticed much earlier such a huge power, but neither he nor Kagutsuchi felt anything. It was as if something had just now been born. The boys walked out into a square that had been turned into ruins. In the center stood a fiery silhouette. The something was a being with special power and different from the others. The creature with a sturdy physique had muscles burned by the flames, which gave it a more intimidating appearance. With a shout, it rushed to the attack.